in the heart of rural Texas, where generations of tradition run as deep as the roots of ancient oak trees, one family's legacy was about to face its greatest test. The Hendersons had raised bulls for rodeo competitions for over 70 years, breeding champions that had become legends in the circuit. But nothing could have prepared young Jake Henderson for the moment his father told him he had to ride Goliath, the massive black bull born and raised on their own ranch. It was a family tradition, a rite of passage that every Henderson man had completed. Yet something was different about Goliath. From the moment he was born, the bull had shown unusual behavior that puzzled even the most experienced ranchers. As Jake stood at the edge of the corral, watching the 2,000-pound animal move with surprising grace, he felt something he had never experienced before. Fear mixed with curiosity, duty clashing with instinct. What Jake didn't know was that his 8 seconds on Goliath's back would reveal a truth that would change not just his life, but the entire legacy of the Henderson family forever. Jake Henderson woke up before dawn on his 21st birthday, the same way his father had and his grandfather before him. The tradition was older than the ranch itself, passed down through generations like a sacred ritual. Every Henderson man had to prove himself by riding a bull raised on their own land, demonstrating the connection between rancher and animal that defined their way of life. But as Jake pulled on his boots in the dim light of his bedroom, surrounded by trophies and photographs of his ancestors and similar moments of glory, a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach that he couldn't quite explain. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of Texas hill country, a patchwork of green pastures separated by weathered wooden fences that had withstood decades of harsh weather and harder times. The family had built their reputation on understanding bulls better than anyone else in the state. They knew how to read the animals, how to predict their movements, how to breed champions that rodeo riders feared and respected in equal measure. Jake's father, Samuel Henderson, had spent 40 years perfecting this art, and his knowledge had made the Henderson name synonymous with quality and tradition throughout the rodeo circuit. Goliath had been born 3 years ago during a lightning storm that knocked out power across the county for 2 days. Jake remembered that night vividly. He had been in the barn with his father when Goliath's mother, a prize breeding cow named Delilah, went into labor. The birth had been difficult, and for several tense hours, they weren't sure if either mother or calf would survive. But when Goliath finally emerged, shaking and wet in the beam of their flashlights, Jake had felt an inexplicable connection to the animal. Perhaps it was because he had helped bring him into the world, or perhaps it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. From the beginning, Goliath was different. While other bull calves played rough, butting heads and establishing dominance, Goliath stood apart, watching with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold more awareness than any animal should possess. He grew faster than his siblings, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the Texas sun, his muscles developing with a symmetry that made even experienced ranchers stop and stare. But it wasn't his physical attributes that made him special. It was his temperament, his unusual calmness, the way he seemed to understand human voices and respond to them with a comprehension that defied explanation. Jake's father had noticed it too, though he attributed it to good breeding and patient handling. He had been the one to name the bull Goliath, inspired by his size and presence, but also by the biblical challenge the name represented. Samuel saw the bull as the ultimate test for his son, the perfect animal to prove that Jake had inherited not just a family business, but the family gift for understanding these magnificent creatures. He had spent 3 years training Goliath specifically for this moment, preparing both bull and rider for the 8 seconds that would define Jake's place in the Henderson legacy. But Jake had spent those 3 years developing a different relationship with Goliath. In the quiet hours before dawn and after sunset, when the other ranch hands had gone home and his father was busy with paperwork, Jake would visit the bull's pen. He would sit on the fence rail and talk to Goliath, sharing his dreams and fears, His doubts about following in his father's footsteps, his questions about whether this life of tradition and expectation was truly meant for him. And Goliath would listen, his massive head lowered, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on Jake with an attention that felt almost human. In those moments, Jake felt understood in a way he never had with his father or anyone else in his family. Now, as the sun began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of orange and pink, Jake walked toward the main corral where his entire family had gathered. His mother stood near the gate, her face a mask of practiced composure that didn't quite hide the worry in her eyes. His grandfather, 83 years old and still ranch tough, leaned against the fence with his characteristic stoic expression. His uncles, cousins, and various ranch hands formed a semicircle around the corral, creating an audience that felt more like a jury. And in the center of it all stood his father, checking the rigging one final time, his movements precise and confident, showing none of the doubt that was eating away at Jake's resolve. Goliath stood in the loading chute, impossibly calm for a bull about to be ridden. His dark eyes found Jake immediately, and for a moment, the young cowboy could have sworn he saw something in that gaze. Recognition, yes, but also something else. Something that looked remarkably like trust or perhaps a question. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his riding glove, a subtle shake that he hoped no one else noticed. In just a few minutes, he would climb onto Goliath's back. The gate would open, and everything would change. He could feel it in his bones, a premonition that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with the inexplicable connection he shared with the bull standing before him. The preparation ritual unfolded with the mechanical precision of ceremony. Jake's father helped him into his protective vest, each strap pulled tight with practiced efficiency, each buckle checked twice with the thoroughness that had kept 3 generations of Hendersons alive in a dangerous profession. The leather chaps came next, worn smooth by years of use, originally his grandfather's before being passed down. As Samuel worked, he talked in that steady, instructive tone that Jake had heard his entire life, explaining techniques and strategies, offering advice that came from decades of experience riding bulls that had tried their best to kill him. But Jake barely heard the words. His attention kept drifting to Goliath, who remained unnaturally still in the chute, as if waiting for something. The other bulls the Hendersons had raised would be agitated by now, sensing the tension in the air, reacting to the crowd and the confined space with snorts and aggressive movements. Goliath simply stood there, his massive sides expanding and contracting with each breath, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. It was unsettling in a way that Jake couldn't articulate to anyone, especially not to his father, who saw only a perfectly trained animal ready to perform its role in their family tradition. The ranch hands who had gathered to watch shifted uncomfortably in the morning heat. They had all seen bulls before, thousands of them over their combined years of work, but there was something about Goliath that made even the most experienced among them uneasy. Old Pete, who had worked for the Hendersons for 40 years and had helped deliver Goliath that stormy night, kept his distance from the chute, his weathered face creased with concern. When Jake caught his eye, Pete gave a subtle shake of his head, so slight that only Jake noticed it. But what did it mean? Was Pete questioning the ride or questioning something about Goliath himself? Jake's mother approached with a cup of water, her hand steady despite the worry etched in the lines around her eyes. Martha Henderson came from a rodeo family herself, and she understood the necessity of this moment in ways that outsiders never could. But she was also a mother, and Jake could see the conflict playing out behind her composed exterior. She had watched her husband ride dangerous bulls for 20 years before he retired from competition. She had seen him broken and bruised, had nursed him through injuries that would have ended lesser men's careers. Now she was about to watch her only son face the same risks, and tradition demanded that she stand strong and supportive, even as her heart screamed for her to stop this madness. Jake's grandfather made his way over, moving with the careful deliberation of age, but with eyes that were still sharp and assessing. William Henderson was a legend in Texas rodeo circles, a man who had ridden bulls when the sport was even more dangerous than it was now, when safety equipment was minimal and medical care was a distant town away. He had survived broken bones, punctured lungs, and a bull's horn that had come within inches of his spine. He had taught his son Samuel everything about bulls, and Samuel had taught Jake, creating an unbroken line of knowledge and tradition that stretched back to when the ranch was first established. The old man placed a gnarled hand on Jake's shoulder and looked him directly in the eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied his grandson with an intensity that made Jake feel transparent, as if all his doubts and fears were visible on his face. Then William spoke, his voice rough as gravel but still commanding. He told Jake that every Henderson man had felt fear before this moment, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He reminded Jake that their family's bond with bulls wasn't about dominance or conquest, but about respect and understanding. The ride wasn't about proving superiority over the animal, but about demonstrating the connection between human and beast. That was the foundation of their legacy. But then the old man added something unexpected, something that seemed to contradict everything he had just said. He told Jake to trust his instincts above all else, even if those instincts went against tradition. He said that sometimes the greatest courage was knowing when to choose a different path, when to question what everyone else accepted as truth. The words hung in the air between them, cryptic and troubling, before William turned and walked back to his spot by the fence, leaving Jake more confused than before. Samuel called for Jake to get into position. The moment had arrived, and there was no more time for doubt or contemplation. The crowd around the corral grew quiet, the morning sounds of the ranch fading into background noise as everyone focused on the chute where man and bull were about to come together in the age-old contest of strength and will. Jake climbed the rails of the chute, his movements automatic, trained through years of practice and observation. He positioned himself above Goliath's broad back, looking down at the bull who had grown from a struggling calf into this magnificent creature. Goliath's head turned slightly, just enough for one dark eye to meet Jake's gaze. In that moment, Jake felt something pass between them, a communication beyond words, beyond the normal boundaries of human and animal interaction. It wasn't hostile or aggressive. It was questioning, almost pleading, as if Goliath was trying to tell him something vitally important. Jake's hand hovered over the bull rope, hesitating in a way that made his father call out sharply, asking if something was wrong. Jake shook his head, unable to explain what he was feeling, unable to put words to the certainty growing in his gut that this ride was different from any that had come before. He lowered himself onto Goliath's back, feeling the animal's warmth through his jeans, feeling the contained power in the muscles beneath him. His hand wrapped around the rope, the familiar rough texture grounding him in the physical reality of the moment. His father called out final instructions from outside the chute. His mother's hand covered her mouth. His grandfather watched with those penetrating eyes. And beneath Jake, Goliath stood perfectly still, waiting for the gate to open, waiting for whatever was about to unfold in the next 8 seconds that would change everything they thought they knew. The gate swung open with a metallic clang that seemed to echo across the entire ranch. Jake's body tensed, every muscle preparing for the explosive buck that experience and training had taught him to expect from a bull of Goliath's size and breeding. His free hand came up for balance, his legs gripped tight, his core engaged, ready for the violent spinning and jumping that should have begun the instant the gate opened. But nothing happened. Goliath didn't buck, he didn't spin. He didn't even move forward with the aggressive charge that lesser bulls used when first released from the chute. Instead, Goliath simply walked into the arena with measured, deliberate steps, as if he was on a casual stroll, rather than participating in the defining moment of Jake Henderson's life. The confusion was immediate and complete. The watching crowd fell into stunned silence, uncertain how to react to behavior that defied every expectation and tradition. Samuel's face flushed red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, his shouts for the bull to be provoked falling into the awkward quiet. But Goliath continued his steady walk, seemingly oblivious to the chaos his behavior was causing, moving in a slow circle around the arena with Jake still clinging to his back in bewilderment. Jake's initial reaction was relief mixed with confusion. The terror that had been building in his chest since dawn began to ease, replaced by a different kind of anxiety. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. His father had ridden a bull that had broken 3 ribs and dislocated his shoulder. His grandfather had barely survived 8 seconds on a beast that had ended 2 men's careers before him. The Henderson tradition wasn't about easy rides or gentle animals. It was about proving yourself against a force of nature, demonstrating your courage and skill against impossible odds. Why did it mean that Goliath, the bull specifically bred and trained for this moment, was acting like a docile riding horse instead of a bucking champion? Around the corral, reactions varied wildly. Some ranch hands laughed nervously, unsure if this was some kind of joke or demonstration. Others looked concerned, whispering among themselves about what could cause a bull to behave so completely contrary to its training and instincts. Jake's mother's expression shifted from fear to confusion to something that might have been relief, though she tried to hide it. But Samuel's face showed only humiliation and growing anger. His lifetime of reputation and expertise suddenly called into question by his own bull's unprecedented behavior. Jake's grandfather remained motionless at the fence, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes tracked Goliath's movement with intense focus. Unlike the others, William Henderson didn't seem surprised by what was happening. Instead, he appeared to be watching for something, waiting for some revelation that only he suspected might come. His earlier words to Jake about trusting instincts suddenly felt more significant, as if the old man had somehow known or suspected that this ride would be different from all the others. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, Goliath came to a complete stop in the center of the arena. Jake remained on his back, still gripping the rope, completely at a loss for what to do. Should he dismount? Should he try to provoke the bull into bucking? Should he stay on until the full 8 seconds had passed, even though nothing was happening? His training hadn't prepared him for this situation, and the rulebook of tradition offered no guidance for a bull that simply refused to perform its expected role. Then Goliath did something that sent a ripple of shock through every person present. The massive bull slowly, carefully, lowered himself to the ground, folding his legs beneath him with a gentleness that seemed impossible for an animal of his size and power. It was a movement that bulls simply didn't make, a posture that went against every instinct and training. And as Goliath settled onto the arena dirt, Jake found himself sitting on the bull's back in a position that looked absurdly peaceful, as if he were sitting on a large patient dog rather than a 2,000-pound rodeo bull specifically bred for aggression and power. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Samuel's angry shouts died in his throat as he witnessed something that his decades of experience had never shown him before. Bulls didn't do this. They couldn't do this. It violated everything known about their behavior and psychology. Bulls were prey animals who defended themselves through aggression when cornered or threatened. They were creatures of instinct and power, not understanding or cooperation. Yet here was Goliath, acting with deliberate intention that suggested not just training, but actual choice, actual decision-making beyond what any animal should possess. Jake slowly released his grip on the rope, his heart pounding not from fear now, but from the profound strangeness of the moment. He slid off Goliath's back and stood beside the bull, his legs shaky, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. Goliath turned his massive head to look at Jake, and once again, the young cowboy saw that unsettling intelligence in the animal's eyes, that sense of communication beyond normal boundaries. The bull's breathing was calm and steady, showing no signs of the adrenaline and aggression that should have been flooding his system. Samuel climbed over the corral fence and stormed into the arena, his face a mask of fury and confusion. He shouted at Jake, asking what he had done to make the bull behave this way, accusing him of somehow sabotaging the tradition, of ruining his own rite of passage through some form of interference or manipulation. But Jake could only shake his head, unable to explain what even he didn't understand. He hadn't done anything to Goliath. He hadn't trained the bull to act this way. The behavior was completely spontaneous, completely unexpected, and completely inexplicable by any conventional understanding of animal behavior. But as Jake stood there in the arena, with his father's angry accusations washing over him and the stunned crowd watching in disbelief, he felt something shift inside himself. The relief he had initially felt was being replaced by a growing realization that perhaps this was not a failure at all. Perhaps Goliath wasn't refusing to perform his role in the tradition. Perhaps instead, the bull was trying to communicate something far more important than anyone had imagined possible. And perhaps Jake's true test wasn't about riding a bucking bull for 8 seconds, but about having the courage to understand what Goliath was actually trying to tell him. The aftermath of the failed ride descended upon the Henderson ranch like a dark cloud. Samuel ordered everyone back to their regular work, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, his movements sharp and agitated as he dealt with the unprecedented situation. The ranch hands dispersed quickly, grateful to escape the tension, but already spreading the story that would soon make its way through every rodeo circuit in Texas. Jake's mother tried to comfort both her son and husband, caught between understanding Jake's confusion and supporting Samuel's wounded pride. Only William Henderson remained at the corral, watching Goliath with that same intense, contemplative expression he had worn throughout the entire strange episode. Jake spent the rest of the morning in a daze, going through the motions of his regular chores while his mind replayed the scene over and over. His father avoided him, communicating only through terse instructions delivered by other ranch hands, his disappointment hanging heavy in the air between them. The other workers gave Jake sympathetic looks mixed with curiosity, but no one quite knew what to say about what had happened. How do you console someone who has failed a test that the test itself refused to administer? How do you explain behavior that defied every known principle of animal training and psychology? By afternoon, Jake found himself back at Goliath's pen, unable to stay away despite knowing his father would disapprove. The bull stood in the shade of a large oak tree, seemingly unbothered by the morning's events, calmly pulling grass from a feeding trough. When Jake approached, Goliath's head came up immediately, his dark eyes focusing on the young man with that same unsettling awareness that had characterized all their interactions. Jake climbed onto the fence rail, taking his usual perch, and for a long time, he simply sat there, trying to make sense of everything. His grandfather found him there as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. William Henderson moved slowly across the dusty ground, his boots raising small clouds with each step, until he stood beside the fence where Jake sat. For several minutes, neither spoke, just watched Goliath together in the golden afternoon light. Then the old man began to talk, his voice quiet but clear, telling a story that Jake had never heard before, a story that had been kept secret within the Henderson family for 3 generations. William revealed that he had experienced something similar during his own rite of passage ride, though not as dramatic or complete as what had happened with Goliath. The bull he was meant to ride, a legendary animal named Titan, had hesitated for just a moment when the gate opened, meeting William's eyes with what the young man then interpreted as a moment of understanding before the animal fulfilled its expected role and nearly killed him in the process. William had carried that memory his entire life, that brief second of connection, That glimpse of something beyond the normal relationship between human and animal. But the old man had witnessed similar moments throughout his decades of working with bulls. Small instances of behavior that suggested greater intelligence or awareness than anyone acknowledged. Bulls that seemed to recognize individual humans and respond differently to them. Animals that appeared to make conscious choices about their level of aggression, as if they understood the consequences of their actions. William had never spoken about these observations because they went against the established understanding of the business, because they threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which the Henderson legacy was built. The rodeo industry, William explained, was predicated on the idea that bulls were essentially unpredictable forces of nature, dangerous animals whose aggression was instinctive and unavoidable. The skill of a rider lay in mastering this wild, uncontrollable power. The art of a breeder lay in channeling and enhancing natural aggression. The entire economic and cultural structure of the rodeo world depended on maintaining this understanding of bulls as magnificent, but mindless creatures driven purely by instinct. But what if that understanding was incomplete? What if bulls possessed more awareness, more choice, more capacity for relationship than anyone wanted to acknowledge? Goliath's behavior, William suggested, was perhaps the most extreme example of what he had suspected his entire career, but never had the courage to fully explore. The bull wasn't defying training or refusing his role out of stubbornness or confusion. Instead, Goliath was making a conscious choice to refuse participation in a tradition that required him to be aggressive and dangerous. The bull was, in his own way, communicating a truth that the Henderson family had built their entire legacy around denying, that these animals were partners, not adversaries, and that the relationship between humans and bulls could be something fundamentally different from what tradition demanded. Jake listened to his grandfather's words with a mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication because it confirmed what he had felt during all those quiet conversations with Goliath, that sense of being truly understood by the animal. Grief because he suddenly understood the weight of the choice before him. He could insist on another ride, could demand that Goliath be provoked or trained more aggressively until he performed the way tradition required. He could preserve the Henderson legacy and his father's pride by forcing the situation to conform to expectations. Or he could acknowledge what Goliath had shown him, could honor the truth that his grandfather had finally spoken, and in doing so, potentially destroy everything his family had built over 70 years. William placed a weathered hand on Jake's shoulder and told him that he had been wrong to pass down a tradition without questioning it, wrong to prioritize legacy over truth, wrong to sacrifice understanding for the sake of reputation. The old man's voice cracked with emotion as he admitted that he had spent 60 years breeding and training bulls while ignoring what they were really trying to tell him. He had seen the intelligence in their eyes and chosen blindness. He had felt the potential for connection and chosen dominance instead. Now, in the twilight of his life, watching his grandson face the same choice, he finally had the courage to speak the truth he had suppressed for so long. As darkness began to settle over the ranch, Jake sat with his grandfather beside Goliath's pen, both of them watching the bull who had refused to cooperate in his own exploitation. The weight of 3 generations pressed down on Jake's shoulders, the expectations, and traditions and reputations, all demanding that he find a way to make this right according to the old rules. But Goliath stood calm and patient in the growing shadows, waiting for Jake to understand what the bull had been trying to communicate all along. That there was a different way possible, a better way if only humans had the courage to listen. The confrontation with Samuel was inevitable and came sooner than Jake had hoped. That evening, as the ranch settled into its nightly routine, his father summoned him to the barn office, a small room filled with decades of records, trophies, and photographs documenting the Henderson family's achievements. Samuel stood behind his desk, his face rigid with an anger that had been building throughout the day. his hands braced on the worn wooden surface as if he needed physical support to contain his emotions. His father's words came fast and sharp, accusations mixed with demands for explanation. He wanted to know what Jake had done to Goliath. What secret training or manipulation had caused the bull to humiliate their family in front of the entire ranch? He insisted that Jake had sabotaged his own test, whether through cowardice or some misguided attempt to avoid the challenge that every Henderson man had faced. Samuel's voice shook with a fury born not just from anger but from fear. Fear that everything he had built, everything he had dedicated his life to, was somehow being rejected by his own son. Jake tried to explain, tried to share what his grandfather had told him, tried to express his own growing understanding of what Goliath had been communicating. But Samuel wouldn't hear it. He dismissed William's theories as the confused ramblings of an old man whose mind was failing, refused to entertain any suggestion that bulls were anything more than animals whose behavior could be explained and controlled through proper training and handling. To acknowledge what Jake and William were suggesting would mean admitting that his entire career, his father's legacy, the foundation of the Henderson reputation, was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of the animals they claimed to understand better than anyone. The argument escalated, both men saying things they would later regret. The accumulated tension of the day exploding into accusations and recriminations that cut deeper than either intended. Samuel demanded that Jake commit to another ride, this time with Goliath properly provoked and prepared, insisting that the family's reputation depended on completing the tradition correctly. He threatened to sell Goliath if Jake refused, to send the bull away to another ranch where he would be retrained or possibly destroyed if his behavior couldn't be corrected. It was an ultimatum born of desperation, a father trying to preserve his worldview by forcing his son to conform to expectations that Jake no longer believed in. Jake's mother burst into the office then, her usual composure shattered by the raised voices and the breaking of her family. Martha Henderson had remained silent throughout the day's drama, allowing the men in her life to work through the situation as tradition demanded. But listening to father and son tear each other apart over a question that seemed to be destroying everything she loved finally pushed her past her limit. She demanded they both stop, her voice carrying an authority that years of quiet support had masked but never diminished. Martha spoke with a clarity and force that stopped both men in their tracks. She reminded them that the Henderson Ranch was built by her father-in-law and sustained by all of them together, that no single tradition or test or reputation was worth destroying their family. She told Samuel that his pride was blinding him to what their son was trying to express, and she told Jake that his father's entire identity was wrapped up in a legacy that he could simply abandon without feeling like his life had been wasted. She demanded that they find a way forward that honored both the past and the possibility of a different future. Her words created a fragile pause in the conflict, a momentary ceasefire that allowed everyone to step back from the edge. Samuel slumped into his chair, the fight draining from him as he confronted the reality that his son might truly believe something fundamentally different from everything he had taught him. Jake felt the weight of his father's disappointment settle onto his shoulders, understanding for the first time the depth of Samuel's investment in the tradition and the genuine pain his rejection of it was causing. William Henderson appeared in the doorway then, his presence commanding attention despite his age. The old man carried a worn journal, its leather cover cracked and faded, its pages yellowed with time. He entered the office slowly, deliberately, and placed the journal on Samuel's desk with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. This, William announced, was a record he had kept for 40 years, documenting every observation, every moment of unusual behavior, every instance where bulls had shown capabilities beyond what conventional wisdom acknowledged. Page after page revealed a secret history of the Henderson Ranch, stories of bulls who recognized individual humans by sight, animals who appeared to make choices about their level of aggression based on the situation, instances where bulls had shown what could only be described as problem-solving intelligence or even empathy. William had recorded it all, writing in secret because he feared what acknowledging these truths might mean for the business and reputation his family depended upon. But now, watching his son and grandson fight over the same questions he had grappled with his entire career, he finally found the courage to share what he had been hiding. Samuel read through the journal with trembling hands, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally, a kind of grief. Jake watched his father confront evidence that challenged everything he believed, saw the moment decades of certainty began to crack and crumble. The silence in the office stretched long and heavy as Samuel absorbed revelation after revelation, each entry in the journal forcing him to reconsider memories and experiences through a new lens, to acknowledge possibilities he had always dismissed or ignored. Finally, Samuel looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting first his father's, then his son's. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and raw. He asked what they were supposed to do with this information, how they were supposed to continue running a business built on assumptions they now questioned. He expressed fear about what would happen to the Henderson reputation if they acknowledged publicly what William S. Journal suggested. Worry about the economic consequences of fundamentally changing their approach to breeding and training bulls. But beneath the practical concerns, Jake could hear something else in his father's voice, a tentative openness to possibility. A willingness to at least consider that the world might be more complex than he had believed. Jake seized the moment, proposing something that terrified and excited him in equal measure. What if they used Goliath not to preserve the old tradition, but to establish a new one? What if instead of forcing the bull to conform to expectations of aggression and danger, they listened to what his behavior was communicating? They could study Goliath's intelligence, document his capabilities, use him as proof that a different relationship between humans and bulls was possible. It would mean risking their reputation, yes, but it might also mean discovering something profound about animals that the entire rodeo industry had misunderstood for generations. The decision to fundamentally change the direction of the Henderson Ranch didn't happen overnight, but once the family began moving toward that future, momentum built quickly. Samuel spent weeks studying his father's journal, cross-referencing entries with his own memories, gradually accepting that his lifetime of experience might have been built on incomplete understanding. The process was painful for him, requiring a humility that went against every instinct of his proud nature. But Martha, as steady support, and William, as patient guidance, helped him navigate the difficult transition from certainty to questioning. Jake became Goliath's primary handler and the focus of what they began calling the project. Instead of training the bull for rodeo performance, Jake spent hours each day simply interacting with Goliath, documenting his behavior, testing his problem-solving abilities, exploring the depths of his apparent intelligence. What they discovered amazed everyone, even William, who had suspected unusual capabilities. Goliath could distinguish between different humans at a distance, remember sequences of actions, respond to complex verbal instructions, and even demonstrate what appeared to be emotional reactions to situations that went far beyond simple stimulus response patterns. Word about what was happening at the Henderson Ranch spread slowly at first, then with increasing speed through the rodeo community. Reactions ranged from curiosity to skepticism to outright hostility. Some fellow ranchers and riders saw the Hendersons' new direction as a betrayal of tradition, an attack on the foundations of the sport they all loved. Others, particularly younger people in the industry, expressed fascination and support, admitting they had observed similar behaviors in their own bulls, but never felt they could acknowledge them publicly. The Henderson family found themselves at the center of a growing controversy that divided the rodeo world between those who clung to traditional understandings and those willing to consider new possibilities. Samuel made the difficult decision to stop breeding bulls for traditional rodeo competitions. instead focusing on animals that could be studied and understood on their own terms. It was an economic risk that kept them awake at night, worrying about whether they could sustain the ranch through this transition. But unexpected opportunities began to emerge. Universities contacted them about research partnerships. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell their story. Animal welfare organizations saw their work as a potential model for more ethical relationships with livestock. The Henderson Ranch began to transform from a traditional breeding operation into something new, something that bridged the gap between ranching tradition and scientific understanding. The most profound changes, however, were personal rather than professional. Jake's relationship with his father deepened as Samuel gradually acknowledged his son's insights and apologized for his initial refusal to listen. They spent long evenings talking about the future of the ranch, planning new directions, discussing the ethical implications of their work with animals. They now recognized as far more aware than they had previously acknowledged. The rigid hierarchy that had defined their relationship began to soften into something more collaborative, more respectful of Jake's perspective and choices. William lived long enough to see the beginning of the transformation he had hoped for, but never quite dared to initiate himself. In one of their last conversations, the old man told Jake that Goliath had given him a gift he had never expected. The chance to correct a lifetime of mistakes before he died, the opportunity to see his family choose truth over tradition. William passed away peacefully one autumn evening, content in knowing that the Henderson legacy would continue, but in a form more honest and humane than what he had inherited. Goliath himself became something of a celebrity, featured in articles and videos that challenged conventional understanding of animal intelligence. But for Jake, the bull remained what he had always been: a friend, a teacher, a reminder that courage sometimes meant rejecting what everyone expected in favor of what you knew to be right. The 8 seconds Jake never rode on Goliath's back taught him more than any successful ride could have, proving that true strength lay not in dominating another creature, but in having the humility to learn from them. Years later, standing at the fence of the main corral with his own young son, Jake watched Goliath grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. The bull was older now, slower, but his dark eyes still held that same remarkable intelligence that had changed everything. Jake's son asked about the family tradition, about the rides his father and grandfather and great-grandfather had made. Jake smiled and told his son about a different tradition, one that started the day a bull refused to buck and a young cowboy had the courage to ask why. The Henderson Ranch never returned to its old ways. Instead, it became a leader in ethical animal treatment and genuine understanding of bovine intelligence. The financial success wasn't immediate, but it came, built on a foundation of authenticity and truth, rather than exploitation and tradition. More importantly, the Hendersons found a sense of purpose that went beyond reputation or legacy. They had learned that the greatest traditions aren't the ones we preserve unchanged, but the ones